Most of us agree our planet is broken. But what we struggle to agree on is how we should fix it.
Should we recycle more?
Stop eating meat?
Write to our MPs.
Boycott certain products?
Join demonstrations.
Glue ourselves to buildings? So in this episode of Our Broken Planet, we are going to be exploring the link between science and activism.
We're revealing the role of research, meeting the campaigners fighting to create change, and diving into the psychology of winning hearts and minds.
There's an important role for scientists, activists, and political leaders to play in communicating that it is still possible to address climate change.
The most important part was my people. Without them, I couldn't do it.
If even one person doesn't buy an SUV because of what we're doing, then we've won.
It is, with a David and Goliath situation, the only way that we can get the attention of the world.
From the Natural History Museum, this is Our Broken Planet, where we've been finding out how we created some of the problems of our modern world and searching for solutions from nature and science. I'm Khalil Thurlaway.
And I'm Tori Herridge. Across this series, we've explored the interconnected issues facing our Earth and asked the question, what can we do about it?
And in the final episode of this series of Our Broken Planet, we're taking to the streets to find out about the role that direct action plays in challenging the climate crisis.
The first evidence that human activity was contributing to global warming came more than 100 years ago, but we're still playing catch-up.
So, what's the deal? We're a society that claims to champion science, technology, progress. So, why have scientists been ignored?
And what should scientists do about the fact they've been ignored?
My whole reason of living is to look after this planet, is to leave something better behind, is to study. I'm curious. I want to know what's going on.
Dr. Erica McAlister is a senior curator for Diptera and Siphonaptera, that's flies and fleas, at the Natural History Museum.
It's really, really upsetting when you can see with direct evidence that the insect populations are being hurt, are being changed, are being damaged by climate change.
How has your research been impacted by the climate crisis?
Well, I guess my whole life has been impacted by the climate crisis. But my research, I'm seeing huge changes going on. I'm seeing changes in population numbers. I'm seeing changes in population distributions. I'm seeing changes in emergence patterns. And so a lot of this would have initially been because of us and introduced species and things like that. But we're definitely now seeing the impact of climate change on all of this.
Have you had any trouble sharing your research or, been challenged or contradicted or ignored when trying to share information about what's happening to life on Earth?
Well, as scientists, we're very, very concerned with data. We like lots of data. So we are mindful when we use expressions like climate change, and I will have many a discussion. But thankfully now I have lots of evidence, lots of smaller papers, lots of work done globally, all looking into this to actually back up my feelings and my own findings.
You mentioned scientists being data-driven people. Does that mean that they have a duty to always be impartial, or do they conversely have a duty to agitate for action if their message isn't being heard?
I don't think scientists are impartial. They like to be factual, but they very much believe in their research and they have a passion for it. I will get very heated and very upset if I'm presenting evidence that shows something that's horrible or has gone wrong or anything like that.
I'd say that Erica's sentiments expressed there would be shared by scientists all over the world. Yeah, anecdotally at least, that feels like sentiments I've heard expressed many times in many places from many different fields of research.
Do you remember a moment when you realised that your research was being impacted by the climate crisis?
But my research is entirely about climate change, pretty much. Ooh.
Where are all these new mammoths coming from?
But that is really interesting, actually. But actually, if you roll back the clock to when I first basically decided to kind of become a scientist, if you want to call it like that moment at school was because of a realisation that climate was changing. I remember it really vividly because it was that point where we were doing global warming in just before GCSE, like year 9 or something like that. And it happened to coincide exactly with the time period in chemistry we were doing about how you can remove carbon dioxide from experiments by putting soda lime in like a little test tube and you bubbled it all over. Yeah, those two things were going side by side in each place. I was like, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Oh, soda lime. And then I wrote a story in English about a futuristic story where scientists tried to stop the world from getting too warm by spraying soda lime into the atmosphere, but they put too much in and they started a new ice age. And then I got obsessed with the ice age from that point onwards. And then I've ended up doing ice age science, and ice age science is all about climate change.
I love that there's an alternate timeline where Tori Herridge is a sci-fi author writing environmental, speculative science fiction about all these different possible futures. Good and bad, hot and cold.
Could still happen.
I mean, I'd read it.
Never say never. I know. No, it was a bit of a rubbish story, but it was actually that moment when I realised that scientists didn't have the answer, and that's when science became interesting. How about you?
Well, my research was looking in Malaysian rainforest plants for new molecules that could be turned into medicines for certain bits of your immune system. And so as part of my discussion, part of my thesis, there was a section where I wrote primarily about the concerns that I had about the consequences of the research and what would be important in our approaches to continuing this research that would make it environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable as well. That is where the data interfaces with the real world.
Yeah, exactly. So here I think is where it gets interesting. For so long, discussion's been about getting people to accept that climate change is happening, that global warming is real, right, for so long. In some ways, people, I think, have got that message, broadly. The problem is the next step, right? It's now we've moved on to potentially what to do about it. And that's when it gets really interesting because you can't separate out the science from the politics.
Direct action is when a group takes part in an activity that disrupts business as usual, with the aim of achieving a particular political goal. There are lots of different kinds of direct action. It's sort of an umbrella term.
Some types of direct action are legal, like taking part in a strike or a boycott. Other types are illegal, sometimes called civil disobedience, which is the non-violent and conscientious breach of the law. Think of civil rights activists in the US who challenge racial segregation by staging sit-ins in white-only spaces.
There's also uncivil disobedience, which, you might have guessed from the name, can involve more aggressive tactics, like attacks on property or infrastructure. And at an extreme level, direct action can also include attacks on people.
Basically, direct action exists on a sliding scale from things that are peaceful to things that are not. And along that spectrum, you'll find that different kinds of action have had different levels of success at different times throughout history.
I think scientists always had the idea that we would write our reports and governments would listen.
Professor Tristram Wyatt is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford. In 2018, he sat down to start work on a new edition of his book, Pheromones and Animal Behaviour.
What I realised was that so many animals were going to be going extinct in the lifetime of my students. And that was a wake-up call. And it made a lot of sense to actually go out and try to do something about it.
So, Tristram joined Scientists for Extinction Rebellion.
I'd seen these scientists in their white lab coats at a non-direct action event, so taking over Trafalgar Square. I mean, in a way, that was a direct action. We stopped the traffic, but that was by agreement.
To introduce some speakers who are going to talk to specific areas of this climate and ecological crisis, and I urge...
And it was a big teach-in, so lots of people were coming up and asking the scientists questions.
Scientists for Extinction Rebellion are a group made up of representatives from across the spectrum of scientific disciplines, from zoologists like Tristram to biochemists, physicists, ecologists and engineers. They believe they have a moral duty to not only document the natural world, but also to take action to protect it.
The first action I was directly involved with was our action against the Business and Energy Strategy Department. And the action was pasting blown up, enlarged pictures of scientific papers, big enough for a minister to read, onto the glass walls of the ministry of the department.
How big were they?
They were about 6 foot square, and the letters of these scientific papers, the titles were at least a foot high.
How tall are you, just to get some idea?
So I'm 5'8".
So these
yes.
papers were bigger than you. I love
Yes.
that. So yeah, you're sort of dwarfed by the science.
I'd gone to the launch of Extinction Rebellion in October 2018, and I'd seen the first direct action where people were sitting in the road, and a friend of mine who was one of the founders had actually got very annoyed with people getting up at the request of the police and said, "We're meant to get arrested." And then when Extinction Rebellion in 2019 took over Oxford Street and the bridges, and I went along to a lot of the talks. I heard Greta speaking, and I was starting to get more involved, but I was also kind of holding back.
We have gathered today because we have chosen which path we want to take, and now we are waiting for the others to follow our example.
Looking back, I wish I had sat down on the street a lot more.
What changed?
I think gradually just things getting worse. I'd always had this idea that climate change was something that was fractions of a degree. It was all about average temperatures. And I think what has gradually changed is a realisation that things can go wrong in unexpected ways that are not about the average, they're about sudden new extremes. And something that would have been a once-in-a-thousand-year event is now 2 years in a row, perhaps 3 or 4 times in a decade. And that's new. And at the same time, realising that governments were doing the opposite of what they should be doing.
Despite targets to limit the warming of our planet to only 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030, governments around the world have not yet taken the necessary steps to achieve this target. Extinction Rebellion, or XR as they are also known, believe more should be done. In April and October 2019, XR brought central London to a standstill over days of protests. Thousands of people were arrested, costing the Metropolitan Police an estimated £37 million.
They were testing a model, which was, could we get enough people arrested to get the government's attention? And with the way that the police were interacting with Extinction Rebellion at the time, there were more than 1,000 arrests. We were, perhaps surprisingly, allowed to take over the city in an extraordinary way. And it was to the extent that we had, I think it would have been Theresa May's government declaring a climate emergency. For that moment, it did look as though we had a moment of change.
What do you think about people who say that they find things like the disruptive activism of people like Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, kind of annoying and basically unhelpful?
It is designed to be annoying, and that's what's always been the case with nonviolent civil disobedience, whether we're talking about the campaigns in the American South for integration. I think when it's directed at the general public with the slow marches in the street, it has been attracting attention from the news media. And the reason I think the nonviolent civil disobedience in those very focused ways that disrupt cultural and sporting events, although it's hugely annoying, it's over very quickly, it's designed to be an interruption, I think it's probably the way to go. And it is, with a David and Goliath situation, the only way that we can get the attention of the world.
I thought it was really interesting about Tristram focusing so much on the media aspect of it all, and I think that tells you very much about, one of the key aspects of direct action maybe isn't the action itself, but keeping it in the conversation.
And it's interesting to think about how things are perceived now and how things will be perceived in the future. So, for example, if you take the suffragette movement, at the time, there was a hostile media environment, and they were portrayed as uppity and inconvenient and unladylike and a nuisance. But in retrospect, we see them as important mediators of positive social change.
Yeah, that idea that, you're being disrupted is kind of the point. That's kind of the key point, right? And Tristram's point in some ways, like, any publicity is good publicity. It's like keeping it front and centre, I think, is kind of interesting there, isn't it?
Is all publicity good publicity? Because there have been recent surveys of, for example, the British public that say that more than half, 57% of people, think that slow walking as a form of protest should be against the law. And 64% of Britons have an unfavourable opinion of the group Just Stop Oil, who've been disrupting cultural events like Wimbledon and snooker and things like that. And only 17% of Brits have a favourable opinion.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because you also get, we're going to shout statistics at each other. We also know that 3 out of 4 Britons think that climate change is a serious global threat, right? So you've got that worry is still there. And I think that's an interesting sort of counterpoint to each other. You've got that 1 in 4 people saying it's out of control. But then people think, just over half, 52%, think there is still time to deal with it.
So we know there's a problem. We know there's still time to deal with it. But we don't want to be inconvenienced in the doing something about it. Or maybe is it that people don't feel like they are the ones responsible, and so they feel unjustly targeted?
I got this amazing chance to go and talk to people for this podcast, and sort of vox pop them on the streets. And that what you've just paraphrased there is effectively the thought process of almost every single person that we talk to. How do you feel about the state of our planet?
I think it's very scary. It's not great.
It's clear to see that it is changing with the summer's getting hotter and all that, and sure it's lashing down with rain in the middle of July. It's obviously something's not right.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it?
What do you feel about activists that take part in disruptive activism?
I honestly think that takes it a bit far.
Going about it in that fashion and that manner is more disruptive than it is helpful.
No one's going to listen in any other way, so how do you do it? Kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, aren't you?
So they're worried about the planet. They don't like direct action. They think people at Just Stop Oil are targeting the wrong people, but they think something should be done. One thing I took most about it was actually how much people had thought about it, which is really interesting. It wasn't sort of like a knee-jerk, reaction that, that's just annoying. They were like, yeah, it is actually really annoying and it's making me feel uncomfortable. But also to then go to the next session and think about it, because most people then would come to the point, well, what do we do? And then there was usually a big pause. And that's, I think, the space that most people are operating in, what do we do?
And I guess getting people to think about something that is as scary as the environmental crises is part of what the movement is aiming for. It's a step along the way.
Now, let's turn to the idea of uncivil disobedience. A frequent criticism levelled against activists who slow march in the streets is that they're targeting the wrong people. Working people who are just trying to go about their lives aren't the ones contributing the most to the climate crisis. But what about those individuals in society who do contribute more than their fair share? Think people flying about in private jets or taking business trips when a Zoom call might have sufficed. What about people who live in cities but own large, particularly polluting cars? In 2019, the International Energy Agency found that SUVs are the second largest cause of the global rise in carbon dioxide emissions over the past decade, more than shipping, aviation, and heavy industry. What's more, the increasing number of SUVs being bought are actually cancelling out the carbon being saved by people who've switched to electric cars.
We're people from all walks of life, and we have one aim: to make it impossible to own a huge polluting 4x4 in the world's urban areas.
For the environmental campaigning group, the Tyre Extinguishers, this is unacceptable. So what have they been doing about it? The clue's in the name. We sent them some questions over email to ask them what the purpose of their activism is. Their answers are voiced by one of our producers.
Deflating tyres repeatedly and encouraging others to do the same, it turns a minor inconvenience of a flat tyre into a giant obstacle for driving these massive vehicles around our streets. Politely asking and protesting for these things has failed, so it's time for action.
The Tyre Extinguishers told us they had deflated the tyres on around 20,000 SUVs worldwide. They also pointed us in the direction of an article in The Telegraph from last year covering their campaign. The article suggested that, if you are worried about having your tyres let down, why not try a traditional estate car?
If even one person doesn't buy an SUV because of what we're doing, then we've won.
Sabotaging property isn't just controversial, it's criminal. And some people feel that attacking individuals only deepens the divisions between us on the climate crisis.
In general, we believe that individuals shouldn't be targeted. However, there does come a point when the consumption of an individual is so massive, so egregious, so unnecessary that they do become a target. SUVs are luxury emissions done by the world's richest people, so they have to be targeted.
The Tyre Extinguishers argue that people should be willing to break the law to fight climate change.
We all have to be brave and take this action, even if we find it scary. We find it scary, and we're still out doing it, because climate death is far scarier.
Now, whatever you think of the Tyre Extinguishers' intentions, what they do is obviously illegal, and we can't condone their actions.
One of the inspirations behind the Tyre Extinguishers as a group was a campaign that was run in Sweden, where activists went around one of the wealthy neighbourhoods in one of the cities and they deflated the tyres of SUVs and kind of like put little notes on the windscreen saying, hey, I realise it's really inconvenient, but you know what else is convenient? Have a lovely day on the public transport facilities that are so beautifully provided for you. Now it's one thing to deflate a tyre, but it's the beginnings, if you like, of a process which can escalate higher. One of the people behind that was a person called Andreas Malm, and he has recently written a book which is definitely more controversial, maybe incendiary than deflating tyres, because it's called How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. I got my handbag. Hey, look, it's here. Look, it's got a good front cover.
Ooh, yeah, very eye-catching.
And you'll like the back.
Property will cost us the earth.
Oh, that's quite you, Khalil.
Yeah, I can't say I disagree.
I don't want to stereotype you or anything, but it's like I feel like I know you quite well by now. And I thought, I think Khalil will like that one. But it is quite interesting. I'm reading it at the moment, and it's fascinating. But I mean, it's the critical, I guess, the critical point in it about this is like, if you want to up the ante from peaceful direct action to violent or non-peaceful direct action, then we all know what terrorism is, and it can harm lives. But another way to do it is to take your action to where you think it will have the most impact. And Malm has a very, if you like, distinctly left-wing, anti-capitalism, political ethos, and he is very much focused on the climate crisis. So he says activists need to start thinking about hitting oil production where it hurts. You need to start hitting their business where it hurts. And so it's not about, hearts and minds or blowing up a pipeline to get attention in the same way maybe Tristram was talking about Extinction Rebellion. It's the direct impact of making it impossible for those oil companies to do business.
That's really putting the direct in direct action.
Yes.
And also, when we talk about violence, I think it's important to note that violence doesn't always mean violence against another person or people. Violence against property, violence against power structures. Those can all be forms of violence.
Yeah, regardless, it's really raising the stakes, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's the kind of the critical thing. Is it's once you go from sort of sit-ins and slow walking to actual damage, that is a definite escalation and a raising of stakes for the people committing it. And also then, of course, you get a kind of a raising of stakes from the other side, the government. And it is interesting that we're seeing that governments across the board, actually, with a kind of an increased amount of legislation against protest.
Well, we spoke to someone who knows exactly what it's like to take on a massive corporation under a hostile government and win. The first thing that comes to my mind when I think about the Amazon is it's so big. And I mean both the river and the forest. They're parts of the same superorganism. It's dense and busy with all sorts of life, big and small. But at the same time, it's extraordinarily peaceful. Brazil is a country that's been through a lot. Colonial rule by Portugal as a slavery-based economy was followed by 100 years of political instability, including more than one military coup. Throughout all of this, indigenous peoples have consistently borne the brunt of violence, dispossession, and marginalization. They've had their land stolen by loggers, miners, ranchers, and other destructive industries that have made a few people very rich. It's been a long struggle to get official recognition and enforcement of indigenous land rights, and the fight continues. Alessandra Korap Munduruku is a member of the Munduruku group of Saure-Moibu, an indigenous territory in northern Brazil. She's also the president of the Pariri Indigenous Association. She's speaking to me in Portuguese via video call.
In 2019, when Bolsonaro became president, there were several bills that he was creating, making it easier for companies to enter indigenous land. He started working on a bill intended to legalize gold digging, mining, oil, natural gas, agriculture, and land leasing. And that's when we started to realize that this bill was very bad for our people. We had several demonstrations in Brasilia, and then during these trips, we were informed that Anglo-American was also interested in the Munduruku lands, and not just ours, the territories of other indigenous communities too.
Alessandra became aware of a slew of applications made by British mining company Anglo-American to mine the Saure-Moibu indigenous territory.
So the big international mining companies were wanting to enter the territory without asking the indigenous people, without informing us, nothing. There was no consultation.
If you've listened to our previous episode on mining, you'll know about the damage it does to the environment. It can poison local water, contribute to deforestation, and devastate biodiversity, leaving an area scarred or at worst uninhabitable for animals and people.
As I'm very curious, I asked what was it, what were they doing, and it also came out in a news report. I saw the map, and that was the most worrying thing. So I went back to the territory, talked to the leaders, the chiefs, the women, and we made a protest banner against Anglo-American. And we also wrote a letter saying that even though the territory wasn't demarcated, it was ours. That we weren't going to leave, we were going to fight back, because we were going to defend our territory.
Alessandra leapt into action. Her campaign was efficient, impassioned, and unrelenting. Unable to rely on the government for help and facing a seemingly insurmountable opponent in Anglo-American, Alessandra and the Munduruku knew it was up to them to protect the Amazon. She travelled deep into the rainforest to meet with 45 other indigenous leaders and alert their communities to Anglo-Americans' plans. She worked with organisations like Amazon Watch and Greenpeace, held assemblies and led fundraising efforts. All the while, the Munduruku carried out patrols of the most remote parts of their territory, monitoring deforestation and looking out for illegal activity. Alessandra launched a campaign across social media, demonstrating indigenous resistance to the developments, which quickly built momentum. She filmed videos of locals holding protests and spoken statements by community members.
And our letter, our protest banner was very important. And another thing was the non-indigenous weapons, the phone cameras inside the village, because today we have pictures and videos. That part was crucial.
Battle lines were drawn, and Alessandra found herself under immense pressure, which intensified when her home was broken into and the memory card from her camera was stolen.
The first time they came, I thought it was just a robbery. But then I realized that the documents in my bag, which I had brought from Brasilia, had been stolen. On the camera that we were filming on, they only took the memory card. They didn't take the camera, just the memory card. It was really strange that it wasn't just a robbery, and that there was more to it than that. That was the moment I almost gave up. My son hugged me and said, "Mom, I don't want you to die." I was desperate. I felt alone at the time. But then my friends and partners came to comfort me. I went to my territory, I talked to the women, and then the chief said that he was worried about all the invasions that were happening, and he didn't know what to do. And that was the moment I realized, if someone was listening to me, that I'm getting in the way of something. And then I made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to be afraid, that I wasn't going to run away, that I was going to stand up to them.
Despite the danger Alessandra endured, through her resilience and the solidarity of the communities she coordinated, in May 2021, Anglo-American backed down. They not only withdrew the 13 approved copper mining research permits located in the Saure Muibu territory that Alessandra lives in, but also another 14 applications for mining in other indigenous territories in the Amazon. It was a huge victory. When you learned that Anglo-American had withdrawn their research requests, how did you feel? How did you celebrate your victory?
When I found out it was 2021, I was in the capital, Brasilia, in the middle of the march against Bolsonaro's persecution of indigenous peoples. And the people I was with said, "Alessandra, did you see the news?" Then they showed it to me and I was like, wow, Anglo-American, really? So at that moment we were jumping for joy with the people who were there, but we had to tell our people that Anglo-American were no longer going to mine our lands.
Que beleza. How beautiful. So, in your opinion, what were the most important factors that led to the success of the campaign?
The most important part was my people. Without them, I couldn't do it. I can't decide for my people. Alessandra can't. It's always up to the people.
In Brazil, we have a saying, trabalho de formiguinha, which means the work of little ants, meaning that together we can accomplish extraordinary things we could never achieve on our own.
I like the ant thing.
Right? It's a really beautiful image.
Yeah.
And it's exemplified in what Alessandra was talking about because, indigenous peoples, not just in Brazil, but around the world, can often be, ignored and invisibilized and sidelined. And so coming together and making sure that you can't be ignored is really powerful as a tool.
Yeah, and it's also that kind of, for better or for worse, and it can really, really be for better in these situations, is that power of social media for that exact reason. So, all the people who thought they were a lone voice suddenly have a place where they can all howl into the void together, and suddenly that lone voice becomes a movement. And that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and Alessandra has been pretty clear that, it was a collective effort and she credits everyone involved. But also it's important to acknowledge that, she really was a pivotal figure and took a real pivotal role in that collectivizing, in uniting all of these, different indigenous groups that, might not always have a lot of contact with each other because they, the Amazon is huge.
I guess that is what made Alessandra's campaign so powerful. Her leadership, the unity of those Indigenous communities that she coordinated, and then that solidarity between international organisations and Alessandra and her campaign. These are all of them really interesting psychological factors that actually are known to influence the strength and success of direct action. And that psychology, I think, is, a really interesting way of getting in to the kind of nitty-gritty of direct action. Because psychology can also tell us that hearing stories like Alessandra's, it does more than just give us that warm, fuzzy feeling inside of wow, someone did some good here. It's actually an incredibly useful tool for then inspiring us to go on and take action ourselves, to make change happen ourselves. So that makes it really interesting to hear a bit about that kind of science and the psychology of activism and what the research says about creating change.
I think that there's an important role for scientists, activists, and political leaders to play in showing and communicating that it is still possible to address climate change through collective action.
Dr. Reem Saab is a lecturer in social psychology at the University of Sussex, who specialises in the psychology of political action. She's telling me about a recent study she carried out on Extinction Rebellion members and supporters.
And we found that collective efficacy was strongly linked to the perceived efficacy of collective action in general at achieving social change. And what this shows is that it's really important, if we want to make people feel less powerless, to emphasize how collective action across multiple instances in history has been important for pushing to achieve social change. So it doesn't just have to be through the environment, but even talking about the successes of collective action in general.
Psychologists have identified several important indicators that drive people towards direct action. First of all, you have to believe there's injustice happening and feel emotionally invested in it.
In the case of climate change, for example, we can talk about the perceived threat of climate change itself as a collective grievance that motivates collective action engagement. But we can also talk about climate change as an environmental injustice that afflicts everyone. But we also see that environmentalists, for example, have been shown to be motivated by altruistic concerns, like the impact of climate change on other people. For example, having a shared feeling of anger or moral outrage in response to a situation can be a really powerful motivating factor. But also the research has found that positive emotions can also induce participation in collective action. So, for example, having hope for mitigating climate change, or feeling pride because you have been part of a previous collective action that has helped to do something positive, that has succeeded at some level. These positive emotions can also help spur more activism.
Then there's the belief that taking action will work.
What also seems to be really important is not only for you to feel that your group has a capacity to achieve change, but also for you as an individual to feel that your own personal participation will make a difference.
Next, there's the extent to which you identify with the other activists and feel like you're part of a like-minded group.
One of the most powerful types of identities that spur collective action is what is known as politicized identification. So in the case of climate change, for example, this would mean identifying as an environmental activist or identifying as a member of an activist environmental organization, as opposed to simply identifying as a member of a group that is aggrieved.
And finally, there's the sense of moral conviction that you have about the cause.
So in a sense, we are not perceiving our position, for example, towards climate change as a mere opinion that we hold and that we seek to express, but we come to see it as an issue of morality about what is right and what is wrong. And another related factor here is this notion of moral obligation, where those who participate in collective action feel an inner obligation to participate in order to defend their cause, and sometimes regardless of the consequences that they are going to face.
Reem had so much interesting stuff to say about, basically why direct action happens, which in a nutshell, is it happens when other things aren't working, right? But also at the much more personal level, which I think is really relevant to this feeling of being frozen or feeling hopeless, like you can't do something. And she mentioned a study which broadly showed anxiety across the board, but sometimes that anxiety sort of stemmed into depression, and other times it didn't. And the difference between the groups, depressed versus non-depressed, was the ones that weren't depressed were the ones that were doing something about it or felt they were doing something about it, were taking part in some kind of activism.
I can definitely vouch for the fact that taking action and being part of something greater than yourself can really help with that feeling of helplessness. And the changes that we need to make as a world of people are going to be difficult because we've been in these habits of consumption and these ways of life for so long. And so there's going to be, for all of us, a certain amount of discomfort in not just the changes, but the self-examination that we need to make those changes, both as individuals, but also all the way up the scale to societal changes. Societies are going to have to make some uncomfortable introspections and learn lessons from that and change how we operate.
And in some ways, I think that kind of one of the paralysing aspects that we see maybe in these debates is that either people can't imagine what the future will be like. What could that different future look like? And they can't imagine themselves in it. But also because sometimes it feels like you've got to choose a side, which isn't helpful. And that kind of binary attitude, of whose side are you on? Like, are you on just the oil's side or are you on big oil's side? Most people aren't either. They just want a happy future. They want a good, great, wonderful planet. And that binary attitude is just problematic.
I think what you said earlier about envisaging the future that you want and doing what it takes to make the world go in that direction, that's really important. We've got to keep our eyes on the prize because it's not about, this idea that everything's going to be fine, we don't need to do anything. And it's not about the world is absolutely going to end and there's nothing we can do to help it. It is, we need to decide collectively what future we want and channel our emotions that we feel at the unfairness and the distance between what we have now and what we want, and use that to power the change that we need to make.
Yeah, and that is, again, something that brings it back to local, because yes, you have these big global ideas of what the world should look like, but ultimately you get to make your own little future and you get to shape your own world in your own community, and that can be the building block from which things can work from. So you can go right back down from that big picture into the small and local, where you are the expert, where you know your neighbourhood, you know the most pressing needs locally, and maybe sort of start from there. And bit by bit, those small changes, which don't feel so hard to make, will hopefully build up into something bigger and better for everybody.
Trabalho de formiguinha.
The work of little ants. What a lovely note to end on.
Thanks for listening to Our Broken Planet. We hope you've learned something along the way, and please don't despair. We all have an important role to play in helping to fix the problems in our world. And it starts with having conversations like the ones in this episode and across the series. If you found it helpful, why not share this with friends and family?
That's the end of this series of Our Broken Planet. Thanks for listening, and we hope to be back in your feed soon. In the meantime, we'd love to hear your feedback on what you thought of the series. And you can access the latest nature news, stories, and how to take action on our website. Our Broken Planet is presented by Khalil Thurlaway and me, Tori Herridge. The producer was Artemis Irvin, the series producer is James Tyndale, and the executive producer was Will Yates. Our Broken Planet is a Whistledown production for the Natural History Museum.